All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Nutrition Corner. Coach Tom here. Today we're going to go over carbohydrates. All right, we could talk about this for hours. So to keep it short, I'm just going to give the quick breakdown, what they are, where they come from, what they do for us, and how they interact with us. All right, and try and keep it a little bit more broad so we don't go too crazy with the science. But we know carbohydrate, so it's literally a hydrated carbon. That's where it gets its name from. And they're all derived from plants. Every single one of them, all of the monosaccharides come from plants. Plants take carbon dioxide, they take water, and they take solar energy. They do their thing. They convert it into glucose and oxygen. All right, they also do the same process in reverse for their respiration cycle. So that's photosynthesis versus respiration. Same process, just backwards. All right, so we have our simple and complex carbs. We'll get more into that in a little bit more detail. But our carbohydrates are broken down into either monosaccharide, di, oligo, or polysaccharides. So mono just means one. So our three big main monosaccharides, we have glucose, galactose, and fructose. We have our disaccharides. We have our three main disaccharides, which is just two. So you basically take two of those monosaccharides, join them together through a process where dehydration occurs. We basically take one molecule of water out of the combination of the two, and it fuses them together. So we have, that would be sucrose, maltose, and lactose. All right, and it's just the combination of the two. So sucrose, our basic table sugar, that's combining glucose and fructose together. Maltose is two glucose molecules. Lactose is glucose and galactose. All right, so you basically take a glucose, combine it with one of the other three, and that's our disaccharides. All right, we have the oligosaccharides, which they consider anything between 3 to 9 or 3 to 10, depending on the source that you're going off of. But the 3 to 10 molecules of sugars joined all together. Our bodies are not very well equipped to actually break those down in the stomach or the small intestine. So what happens is those usually pass through into the large intestine, where they feed the bacteria that live there. So we refer to those generally as pre or probiotics. So anything in those categories, that our small intestine doesn't have the enzymes to break those down, so they really just pass through. So think of some of the fibers, things like that. And then we have the polys, where depending on the source, either 10 or anything more than 10 is considered a polysaccharide. There's three basic structures for those. They could be amylose, which is just a straight chain. So just all those sugars lined up in a row. Amylopectin is kind of multiple chains, but it's more branched. So there's a lot of different things going on. It's all over the place. And then there's fiber, which is a block formation. So it doesn't actually have any open ends. And that's going to come into play in a little bit there. But that's the molecular structure is the reason that our body cannot break that down. So talking about our polys, the most common that we always refer to or talk about in terms of carbohydrates is glycogen, because that is the body's storage mechanism for fuel. If your body doesn't need that glucose immediately, it's got its process. It's going to store that glucose as a glycogen molecule. Glycogen itself, it's got a protein core. It's called glycogenin. And then all of the glucose molecules get kind of pinwheeled around it. So it's got that central core, and then they all just kind of spiral off, but there's a bunch of branches in there too. And that branch structure is going to come into play in a second when we talk about how we break down carbs. But a glycogen molecule has anywhere from 100 to as many as 30,000 glucose molecules attached to it. So that's the number one thing that our body uses for fuel. So even if you're on a ketogenic diet and your body's using ketones and fat as fuel, ketones can't pass through the blood-brain barrier. So even if you're on a ketogenic diet, you still have to have some carbohydrates in. So that's why zero-carb diets don't work, and they're really, really bad for you because your brain cannot operate on anything that isn't glucose. So let me see. So we talk about simple sugars versus complex starches, where some will break down more quickly, some will break down a little bit slower. And the reason for that is mostly about the molecular structure. So we talk about amylose being a chain of, so all those sugars just lined up in a row. Well, it doesn't matter how the chain is, there's only two ends of that chain. And carbohydrates get broken down from the ends. So you can only break down this one and then this one. Then you have two more open ends, so you break down here and here. It can only break down something from an open end. So the chain only having two open ends, it can only release two glucose molecules at a time. Now, keep in mind, these are reactions that are happening many times a second all over your body, so it's still there, but it's not a huge source of abundant energy when your body needs it every second. So that's where the amylopectins come in. So these long branch chains. So think of it this way: if I've got all of these branches going all over the place, well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, as many ends as possible, as many ends exist, is how many glucose molecules can break free at any given time. So that's why our body uses glycogen as that storage, because it's got that central protein core, and all of these branches keep coming off of it. And if there's 30,000 glucose molecules attached, there's probably going to be somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 to 10,000, you know, somewhere in that nature, of open ends of available energy ready as soon as your body needs it. So going back to fiber now, because fiber is in a block structure, it's just straight squared, and all of those ends are connected to something. There are no open ends, they're all closed ends. So that's why our body can't break down fiber, and that's why it just passes straight through the stomach, straight through the small intestine. Some of it will get fermented in the large intestine. We call it the pre or probiotics. And then we've got some types of fibers that are soluble fibers that if they don't ferment in the large intestine, so that's our fermenting foods, if you've ever heard about that term, the soluble fibers, they're soluble so they can pass through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. And while they're in the bloodstream, they can grab a handful of fat and it will help clean cholesterol out of the blood. So that's one of the things that we do with that. The insoluble fiber, like I said, it just passes through. But before it passes through, it actually slows down in the stomach first. It actually delays gastric emptying, which at first it sounds like a bad thing. But there are some benefits to it. So delaying the gastric emptying, it stays in your stomach longer, and because your stomach senses that something is in there, it's going to keep producing all these chemicals, namely the acids and enzymes, to try and break these things down. So if you do have other issues or conditions like certain bacterial infections, or can cause ulcers, heartburn, indigestion, like GERD or reflux, things like that. So if you have any of those issues, not trying to deter you, because there's plenty of benefits that far outweigh those risks. But if you have any of those conditions, hit me a message, send us something, send us an email. We'll get you on the schedule. We can talk about stuff like that. At the very least, talk to your doctor. But like I said, not to deter you, because there's plenty of good things that does. So delaying gastric emptying, if your stomach senses that something's in it, it's not sending those hormones to your brain to say that you're hungry. So it actually will help in a weight loss plan because your body feels fuller longer. It doesn't actually get broken down into calories, so it's so you gain on that end. And like I said, it moves things through. I think that's the down and dirty for carbs. I generally, so blanket recommendation, obviously depending on your goals and activity level and things like that. My blanket recommendation for people is usually get about 30% of your calories from carbohydrates. Remember, we aim for about 40% of our calories from proteins, and the other 30% we're going to try and get from our healthy fats. We already talked about proteins and fats. Today was our thing on carbs. Like I said, we could keep going into much more detail than this, and I could really talk about carbs for hours, but that's pretty much the down and dirty, all the quick and important stuff that you would need to know. So until next week, have fun, guys.